In the early years of the 19th century, in a quiet corner of the Kingdom of Hungary, a child was born into a world balanced between tradition and quiet tension. Lajos Kossuth entered life in 1802 within a family of minor nobility, respected by law, yet far from wealthy. This was a society where titles carried honor but not security, where noble identity did little to shield families from economic uncertainty. The Kossuth household lived modestly, shaped by restraint rather than privilege, and this environment gave young Lajos his first lesson. Status alone meant nothing without effort, discipline, and purpose. His father, trained in law, brought the language of courts and contracts into the home. Papers, legal debates, and discussions about rights and obligations were part of daily life, not abstract ideas reserved for elites in distant cities. Through quiet observation, Lajos absorbed an early understanding of how power functioned and how ordinary people were bound by systems they did not control. His mother added a different but equally powerful influence. Deeply religious and morally strict, she instilled habits of self-control, endurance, and emotional restraint. Together, his parents shaped a household where learning was serious, duty was expected, and personal weakness was not easily tolerated. Education became the central path forward. As a boy, Kossuth attended local schools where Latin grammar, history, and rhetoric formed the backbone of instruction. These were not simply academic exercises. They trained the mind to think in structure, persuasion, and logic. He was not remembered as a child prodigy, but as one who listened closely, studied carefully, and improved steadily. Outside the classroom, rural Hungary offered its own lessons. He saw peasants bound to land they did not own, nobles struggling to maintain dignity without wealth, and a rigid social order that left little room for fairness. These scenes did not yet inspire rebellion, but they planted questions that would grow stronger with time. As Kossuth moved into adolescence, the pressures around him quietly intensified. Financial limitations demanded constant effort, reinforcing habits of discipline and self-reliance. At the same time, the broader political atmosphere weighed heavily on the land. Hungary lived under imperial authority, where censorship limited expression and national identity was restrained rather than celebrated. Though still young, Kossuth sensed the unease beneath everyday life, the feeling that something vital was being held back. By 1816, his childhood had already forged a resilient character, observant, controlled, and deeply aware of the gap between law and justice. These early years did not yet create a revolutionary, but they shaped the inner framework of a man who would later speak not only for himself, but for a nation struggling to define its own voice. As Lajos Kossuth moved beyond childhood, education ceased to be merely a family expectation and became the central force shaping his identity. His formal studies took him away from the familiar rhythms of rural life and into institutions where discipline, hierarchy, and intellectual rigor ruled daily existence. These years marked a transition from observation to participation. He was no longer simply absorbing the world around him, but learning how to analyze it, challenge it, and eventually articulate its contradictions. Education, for Kossuth, was not an escape from society. It was preparation for confronting it. His academic path followed the traditional route of aspiring legal minds in Hungary. Yet his engagement with learning was anything but routine. He immersed himself in philosophy, history, and especially law, fields that demanded clarity of thought and precision of language. Legal education trained him to see society not as a collection of individuals, but as a system governed by rules, precedents, and power relationships. He learned how authority justified itself on paper, how rights were defined, limited, or denied, and how language itself could be used as a tool of control. These studies sharpened his analytical instincts and laid the groundwork for the commanding rhetorical style he would later become famous for. Equally important was the environment in which this education took place. Academic life exposed Kossuth to peers from different regions and social backgrounds, many of whom shared unspoken frustrations about the stagnation of Hungarian public life. Outside lecture halls, conversations turned toward reform, identity, and the quiet conflict between local traditions and imperial oversight. While open dissent remained dangerous, ideas circulated carefully, often wrapped in academic discussion. Kossuth listened more than he spoke, absorbing arguments, refining his own positions, and learning how to express disagreement without crossing the invisible lines imposed by authority. His legal training culminated not simply in technical competence, but in a deep understanding of how law could both protect and suffocate a society. As he entered practical legal work, he confronted the gap between legal theory and lived reality. Procedures favored the powerful, justice moved slowly for the weak, and reform was resisted by habit as much as by law. Rather than discouraging him, this realization hardened his resolve. Education had given him more than a profession. It had given him a lens through which to see injustice clearly and the tools to challenge it intelligently. By the end of this period, Kossuth was no longer just a trained lawyer. He was a disciplined thinker, quietly preparing for a public role he had not yet fully claimed, but was steadily moving toward. When Lajos Kossuth entered professional life, the courtroom replaced the classroom, and theory was tested against reality. His early career as a lawyer unfolded in provincial Hungary, far from the grandeur of imperial centers, where law operated not as an abstract system, but as a lived experience shaped by power, habit, and inequality. Here, legal practice was slow, procedural, and deeply influenced by social rank. For Kossuth, these first years were not about prestige or rapid advancement. They were about exposure, watching how the law functioned on the ground and learning who it truly served. As he worked on legal cases and administrative matters, Kossuth encountered a steady stream of ordinary people struggling against entrenched interests. Land disputes, debt claims, inheritance conflicts, and bureaucratic obstruction revealed a pattern that quickly became impossible to ignore. The law promised fairness, yet its mechanisms favored those with wealth, connections, or noble influence. Kossuth's role often placed him between powerless clients and inflexible institutions, forcing him to navigate compromise, delay, and quiet injustice. These experiences sharpened his sense of moral tension and deepened his frustration with a system that defended order more zealously than justice. At the same time, this period allowed Kossuth to refine his most powerful skill: language. Legal advocacy required clarity, persuasion, and emotional control, and he learned how carefully chosen words could influence decisions even within rigid frameworks. He began to stand out not as a flamboyant courtroom figure, but as a precise and disciplined speaker capable of framing arguments that appealed to both law and conscience. His written submissions and oral defenses revealed a growing confidence, and more importantly, a growing awareness of how public argument could shape opinion beyond the immediate case at hand. Gradually, his legal career began to overlap with public life. Through county-level legal work and administrative representation, Kossuth gained access to local political structures where law, governance, and reform intersected. He observed how decisions were made behind closed doors and how reform was postponed through procedure rather than openly rejected. These insights transformed his understanding of power. Law was no longer just a profession. It was a battlefield of ideas, authority, and resistance. By the end of his early legal career, Kossuth had not yet become a national figure, but the foundations were set. He had learned how to confront authority without recklessness, how to expose injustice without slogans, and how to speak in a way that invited listeners to question the world they had long accepted as unchangeable. The transition from law to journalism marked a decisive turning point in Lajos Kossuth's life. Where the courtroom had confined his voice to formal procedure, the written word offered reach, speed, and influence. Journalism allowed him to step beyond individual cases and address the structure of society itself. This was not a sudden leap driven by ambition, but a calculated shift shaped by frustration. Kossuth had learned that legal arguments could expose injustice, yet they rarely mobilized the public. Writing, he realized, could do what court decisions could not. Awaken collective awareness. His earliest political writings emerged in a tightly controlled environment where censorship shaped every sentence. Open criticism of imperial authority was dangerous, and direct political journalism was often impossible. Kossuth responded not with silence, but with strategy. He developed a style that appeared restrained on the surface, yet carried sharp implications beneath. Reports, summaries, and commentaries were crafted carefully, focusing on facts while guiding readers toward interpretation. This indirect approach allowed him to circulate ideas about reform, representation, and national rights without openly challenging the state. In doing so, he learned how to speak to a broad audience without alarming censors, a skill that would later become one of his greatest strengths. As his writing gained circulation, Kossuth began to understand the power of narrative. He did not merely report events, he framed them. Political debates, administrative decisions, and social tensions were presented as parts of a larger story, one in which Hungary's future was being shaped quietly, often without public consent. His tone was serious, disciplined, and deliberately accessible. He avoided abstract theory and instead focused on concrete consequences, showing readers how distant decisions affected everyday life. This approach transformed political discussion from an elite concern into something personal, immediate, and urgent. Over time, Kossuth's journalistic work turned him into a recognizable public voice. Readers began to associate his writing with clarity, resolve, and moral seriousness. More importantly, they began to trust him. Journalism did not simply amplify his ideas, it reshaped his identity. He was no longer just a trained lawyer or an observer of power, but an active participant in the formation of public opinion. By entering political writing, Kossuth stepped onto a wider stage, one where words could move faster than laws, reach further than courts, and quietly prepare a society for change long before it openly demanded it. As the 1830s unfolded, the quiet undercurrents of reform in Hungary began to surface with greater clarity, and Lajos Kossuth found himself moving steadily from the margins toward the center of this emerging movement. The country was no longer defined solely by tradition and inherited structures. A new generation of thinkers and activists sought renewal in administration, economy, and national identity. Kossuth did not arrive as a radical outsider. Instead, he entered as a disciplined communicator whose ideas resonated with those who sensed that gradual reform was no longer sufficient to meet the pressures of the age. His rise within the Hungarian reform movement was closely tied to his ability to connect diverse social groups under a shared vision. While many reformers spoke primarily to aristocratic circles, Kossuth addressed a broader public, arguing that national progress required the participation of all classes. He emphasized economic modernization, the expansion of civic rights, and the need for national self-expression within the framework of existing institutions. Rather than rejecting tradition outright, he reframed it, presenting reform as a continuation of Hungary's historical mission rather than a break from it. This approach allowed him to gain credibility among cautious nobles while inspiring enthusiasm among younger reform-minded intellectuals. Public assemblies and political forums soon became central to his influence. Kossuth's speeches were measured but forceful, built on clarity rather than theatrics. He avoided abstract language, grounding his arguments in practical concerns: taxation, trade, representation, and responsibility. Listeners did not hear slogans. They heard structured reasoning that invited participation rather than obedience. This style transformed him into more than a spokesman for reform. He became a symbol of disciplined opposition, someone who demonstrated that loyalty to the nation did not require submission to stagnation. As his prominence grew, so did resistance to his ideas. Authorities viewed his expanding influence with increasing suspicion, recognizing that his power lay not in formal office, but in persuasion. Yet attempts to marginalize him only reinforced his standing among reformers, who saw in him a figure capable of articulating collective aspirations with precision and restraint. By the end of this period, Kossuth was no longer simply part of the Hungarian reform movement. He was one of its defining voices. His rise reflected a broader transformation within Hungarian society itself, where political awareness was spreading beyond elite circles and reform was becoming not just a proposal, but a shared expectation. As Lajos Kossuth's public role expanded, his political thinking grew sharper and more defined. Liberalism, for him, was not an abstract philosophy borrowed from Western Europe, but a practical response to the conditions of Hungarian society. He viewed liberty as something that had to be built into institutions, laws, and economic life, not merely proclaimed in speeches. At the center of his thought stood a simple but powerful conviction. A nation could not be strong if the majority of its people were bound by outdated obligations that denied them agency and dignity. His criticism of feudalism targeted its structure rather than its symbols. Kossuth argued that feudal privileges distorted responsibility by separating rights from duties. Nobles enjoyed legal exemptions and political influence while contributing little to the financial and administrative burdens of the state. This imbalance, he believed, weakened the nation as a whole. By shielding one class from taxation and civic obligation, feudalism prevented the emergence of a shared national community. Kossuth did not frame this as an attack on nobility itself, but as a call for transformation, urging the privileged to accept equality before the law as the price of true leadership. Economic reform formed a crucial part of this critique. Feudal land relations restricted productivity, discouraged innovation, and trapped both landowners and peasants in inefficient systems of dependency. Kossuth emphasized free labor, secure property rights, and the gradual replacement of compulsory services with contractual relations. He argued that economic freedom would not dissolve social order, but strengthen it by aligning personal interest with national prosperity. In this vision, modernization was not a foreign threat, but a necessary evolution, one that would allow Hungary to compete with more advanced European economies without losing its identity. What made Kossuth's liberal ideology particularly compelling was its moral dimension. He framed reform not only as a matter of efficiency, but of justice. Feudalism, in his view, trained people to obey rather than to participate, fostering passivity where responsibility was needed most. A free nation, he argued, required citizens who understood their rights and accepted their duties willingly. By articulating liberalism in ethical as well as political terms, Kossuth gave the reform movement a deeper sense of purpose. His criticism of feudalism thus became more than opposition to an old system. It became a vision of a future in which freedom, equality before the law, and national solidarity were inseparable. In the years leading up to 1848, the political atmosphere in Hungary was marked by a growing sense of pressure beneath an outward appearance of stability. On the surface, institutions continued to function according to long-established customs, and loyalty to imperial authority was publicly affirmed. Yet beneath this calm exterior, dissatisfaction was spreading across social groups. Economic stagnation, administrative inertia, and the slow pace of reform created a widening gap between the realities of daily life and the promises of the political order. What had once been tolerated as tradition was increasingly experienced as limitation. The relationship between Hungary and imperial power lay at the center of this tension. Political authority was fragmented, with local assemblies retaining formal roles but limited real influence over broader policy. Decisions affecting trade, taxation, and governance were often shaped elsewhere, leaving Hungarian political actors caught between responsibility and powerlessness. This imbalance fueled frustration, particularly among reform-minded elites who believed that national development required greater autonomy in internal affairs. The political system, designed to preserve order, now seemed incapable of responding to change without external pressure. At the same time, social divisions sharpened political debate. The privileges of the traditional elite stood in contrast to the growing demands of emerging professional groups and an increasingly aware rural population. Ideas about representation, equality before the law, and civic responsibility circulated more openly, even when direct political action remained constrained. Public discussion expanded through meetings, speeches, and printed materials, creating a shared language of expectation. Politics was no longer confined to formal institutions. It had begun to enter everyday conversation, transforming private concern into collective unease. By the mid-1840s, this climate had reached a critical stage. Reform was no longer seen as a distant ideal, but as an urgent necessity, while resistance to change appeared increasingly fragile. Authorities attempted to maintain control through caution and delay, yet each postponement intensified public impatience. The political climate before 1848 was thus defined by contradiction. A system determined to preserve continuity, and a society increasingly prepared to challenge it. When change finally came, it did not emerge from sudden inspiration, but from years of accumulated tension in a political environment that could no longer contain the forces it had helped to create. When revolution erupted in 1848, Lajos Kossuth did not step into chaos. He stepped into a moment he had long anticipated. Years of political tension, reform debates, and public expectation converged rapidly, transforming ideas into action. As revolutionary movements spread across Europe, events in Hungary accelerated with remarkable speed. Kossuth emerged not as a spontaneous agitator, but as a figure already shaped by experience, discipline, and credibility. His voice carried weight because it expressed what many had been thinking, but had not yet dared to demand openly. Kossuth's role in the revolution was defined by leadership through articulation rather than command. He became a central figure in shaping revolutionary goals, translating public energy into political direction. Through speeches and public addresses, he framed the revolution not as reckless upheaval, but as a legitimate assertion of national rights. He emphasized constitutional government, civil equality, and national sovereignty, carefully linking revolutionary demands to legal and moral principles. This approach helped maintain unity during the early stages, preventing the movement from dissolving into uncontrolled violence or factionalism. As the revolution progressed, Kossuth assumed greater responsibility within the emerging political structure. He became a key voice in mobilizing resources, rallying public support, and sustaining morale during moments of uncertainty. His speeches reached beyond cities into rural regions, encouraging participation and sacrifice in the name of national survival. Rather than presenting himself as a personal savior, he spoke as a representative of collective will, reinforcing the idea that the revolution belonged to the nation as a whole. This ability to inspire without personal glorification strengthened his authority at a time when leadership legitimacy was constantly tested. Yet Kossuth's role also exposed the limits of revolutionary idealism. As internal divisions deepened and external pressure intensified, he faced impossible choices between compromise and resistance. Each decision carried consequences not only for political outcomes, but for human lives. Despite these challenges, his conduct during the revolution left a lasting mark. He embodied the transition from reformer to revolutionary statesman, demonstrating how ideas forged over decades could be carried into moments of crisis. Even as the revolution faltered, Kossuth's role ensured that it would not be remembered merely as a failed uprising, but as a defining chapter in Hungary's struggle for political self-determination. The appointment of Lajos Kossuth as Minister of Finance marked a critical shift from revolutionary rhetoric to the hard realities of governance. At a moment when Hungary was attempting to transform political aspirations into functioning state authority, financial control became a matter of survival. The new government faced empty coffers, disrupted trade, and the looming costs of defense and administration. Kossuth's appointment was not merely symbolic. It reflected a widespread belief that the revolution required disciplined organization as much as passion. Managing the nation's finances meant deciding whether the revolutionary state could exist beyond its ideals. Kossuth approached the ministry with a sense of urgency, shaped by crisis rather than theory. The financial system he inherited was fragmented and dependent on imperial structures that no longer aligned with Hungary's political goals. Revenue collection was inconsistent, currency circulation unstable, and public confidence fragile. Kossuth understood that economic independence was inseparable from political sovereignty. Without control over taxation, spending, and monetary policy, the revolution would remain vulnerable. His task was therefore not only to fund a government, but to redefine the relationship between citizens and the state through shared financial responsibility. One of his most challenging responsibilities was securing resources for national defense. As external pressure mounted, military organization demanded immediate and sustained funding. Kossuth worked to mobilize public contributions, state loans, and emergency measures, appealing directly to patriotism rather than coercion. These efforts turned financial sacrifice into a political act, linking economic participation to national survival. While risky and often improvised, this strategy helped sustain resistance during critical phases of the conflict and reinforced the idea that the state drew its strength from collective commitment rather than inherited privilege. Kossuth's tenure as Minister of Finance revealed the burdens of revolutionary leadership more clearly than any speech could. Every decision carried consequences that extended beyond balance sheets, affecting morale, legitimacy, and international perception. He faced criticism from those who demanded immediate results and from those who feared instability. Yet his efforts demonstrated a central truth of the revolution. Freedom required structure, and independence demanded accountability. By stepping into this role, Kossuth proved that his leadership was not confined to ideals alone, but extended into the difficult, often thankless work of building a state under pressure. The Declaration of Independence marked the most dramatic and irreversible moment of the Hungarian Revolution, and it placed Lajos Kossuth at the very center of history. By this stage, compromise had collapsed under the weight of armed conflict and broken trust. The political struggle had evolved into a fight for survival, forcing revolutionary leaders to confront a final question. Could Hungary exist as a sovereign state, or would it be absorbed once more into imperial control? The declaration was not a gesture of enthusiasm, but a decision made under extreme pressure, shaped by military realities and the conviction that retreat would mean surrendering the future entirely. When independence was proclaimed, Kossuth emerged as the symbolic and practical leader of the new state. His assumption of presidential authority did not resemble the calm transfer of power seen in stable governments. It occurred in an atmosphere of emergency, where legitimacy had to be asserted through resolve rather than tradition. Kossuth understood that the declaration alone could not secure independence. It had to be defended politically, militarily, and morally. As president, he became the voice of the nation both at home and abroad, tasked with explaining why Hungary's cause was not rebellion, but self-determination. In this role, Kossuth carried an immense burden. Internally, he faced the challenge of holding together a fragile political structure strained by war, shortages, and exhaustion. Externally, he sought recognition and support from foreign powers, aware that international legitimacy could determine survival. His speeches and proclamations during this period were urgent and unembellished, aimed at sustaining unity rather than inspiring idealism. Leadership now meant endurance, maintaining coherence in a state born amid conflict, where every setback threatened to unravel authority. The presidency also exposed the limits of revolutionary power. Military defeats, diplomatic isolation, and overwhelming external forces narrowed Kossuth's options with each passing month. Yet even as defeat approached, his leadership during the Declaration of Independence ensured that Hungary's struggle would be recorded as an act of conscious political will rather than a failed uprising. By assuming the presidency at the revolution's most perilous hour, Kossuth transformed himself from a reformer and statesman into a national symbol. The declaration and his brief presidency did not secure lasting independence, but they fixed Hungary's claim to sovereignty firmly in history, an assertion that would outlive the revolution itself. The war that followed the Declaration of Independence forced Hungary into a struggle far larger than its original aims. What began as a conflict with imperial authority escalated into a full-scale confrontation against two of Europe's most powerful military forces. The armies of Austria, determined to restore control, regrouped with renewed purpose, while diplomatic calculations in the courts of Europe quietly turned against the Hungarian cause. The conflict was no longer only about internal sovereignty. It had become a test of whether a revolutionary state could survive in a continent dominated by empires. As the fighting intensified, the entry of Russia transformed the war decisively. Russian intervention was not driven by local interests alone, but by fear of revolutionary contagion spreading across Europe. Vast, disciplined forces crossed borders to suppress what was seen as a dangerous precedent. For Hungary, this meant facing an enemy whose resources and manpower dwarfed its own. The war shifted from a struggle of resistance into a battle of endurance, where courage and improvisation were measured against overwhelming numbers and logistical superiority. Throughout this phase, Lajos Kossuth's role was defined less by command and more by resolve. He worked to sustain morale as battlefield fortunes fluctuated, urging perseverance even as losses mounted. Communication became as vital as strategy. Each defeat threatened not only military positions, but public confidence, and Kossuth's task was to prevent despair from dissolving the national effort. He framed the war as a defense of collective dignity, emphasizing that resistance itself carried meaning, regardless of outcome. In doing so, he sought to preserve unity in a society strained by exhaustion and sacrifice. Ultimately, the combined pressure of Austrian coordination and Russian force proved impossible to withstand. One front collapsed after another, and the revolutionary state faced the reality of military defeat. Yet the war against Austrian and Russian forces left a lasting imprint on history. It demonstrated both the limits of revolutionary power in a hostile international order and the depth of Hungary's commitment to self-rule. Though the battlefield was lost, the conflict ensured that Hungary's struggle would not be forgotten or dismissed as disorder. It became a measured stand against empire, one that reshaped national memory and defined a legacy of resistance that endured long after the guns fell silent. The defeat of the revolution did not arrive as a single moment, but as a slow narrowing of possibilities. Military setbacks accumulated, supply lines fractured, and hope gave way to grim realism. One by one, positions that had once symbolized resistance fell into enemy hands. What remained was no longer a question of victory, but of survival, of how the ideals forged in revolution could endure beyond the battlefield. For Lajos Kossuth, this phase marked the most painful transformation of all. From head of a struggling state to a man forced to confront the collapse of everything he had worked to build. As defeat became unavoidable, the revolutionary leadership faced an agonizing dilemma. To continue fighting risked meaningless bloodshed. To surrender risked brutal retribution and the erasure of the revolution's moral legacy. Kossuth understood that his capture would not merely be a personal end, but a symbolic one. He was no longer just an individual. He had become the embodiment of the revolution itself. In this moment, preserving the cause meant stepping away from power. The decision to withdraw was not an act of fear, but a strategic retreat from history's harshest judgment. His escape unfolded under constant danger and uncertainty. Moving across hostile territory, pursued by imperial forces, Kossuth relied on secrecy, speed, and the assistance of sympathizers who risked their own lives to protect him. Each border crossed marked a deeper separation from his homeland. The journey was not triumphant. It was heavy with loss. Behind him lay a defeated revolution, imprisoned comrades, and a nation placed under renewed control. Ahead lay exile, unknown, unstable, and stripped of authority, yet still carrying responsibility. The fall of the revolution did not silence Kossuth, but it changed the nature of his struggle. Escape ensured that the Hungarian cause would not die with its armies. Though the revolution had been crushed, its leader lived on as a witness, a voice, and a reminder. The defeat closed one chapter, but it also ensured that the story would continue beyond borders and generations. In leaving Hungary, Kossuth carried with him not only the memory of failure, but the enduring claim that the revolution had been fought for something real, something powerful enough to survive even its own collapse. The years of exile marked a profound transformation in Lajos Kossuth's life, shifting his struggle from battlefield and parliament to diplomacy and survival. After escaping defeat, he found refuge within the borders of the Ottoman Empire, a state balancing its own complex relationship with European powers. Exile was not chosen for comfort, but for necessity. For Kossuth, crossing into Ottoman territory meant stepping out of immediate danger, yet also stepping into a life defined by uncertainty, surveillance, and political calculation. Freedom now existed without homeland, and safety came at the cost of distance. Life in the Ottoman lands was shaped by restraint rather than activity. Kossuth and other Hungarian refugees lived under protective oversight, their presence tolerated but carefully managed to avoid provoking Austria and Russia. Movement was limited, correspondence monitored, and public political action restricted. Yet within these constraints, exile became a period of reflection and endurance. Cut off from direct influence, Kossuth was forced to confront silence, an unfamiliar condition for a man once surrounded by crowds and urgency. This pause, however, did not extinguish his purpose. It reshaped it. Diplomacy replaced command during these years. Kossuth became acutely aware of the fragile balance that allowed him to remain alive and unextradited. The Ottoman decision to protect Hungarian refugees was itself an act of quiet defiance against imperial pressure, and Kossuth understood its significance. He adjusted his conduct accordingly, avoiding actions that might endanger his hosts while continuing to frame the Hungarian cause in moral and international terms. Even in confinement, he remained politically alert, observing how global power dynamics determined the fate of smaller nations. Exile in the Ottoman Empire stripped Kossuth of authority but strengthened his symbolic role. He was no longer leading a revolution, yet he embodied its memory. These years forged patience, resilience, and a broader understanding of international politics. Far from ending his influence, exile preserved it. Removed from immediate action, Kossuth became a living testament to unfinished struggle, proof that defeat on the battlefield did not erase a nation's claim to dignity or a leader's responsibility to carry that claim forward, even in silence. Exile did not end Lajos Kossuth's political life. It relocated it onto a wider stage. Once free to travel beyond Ottoman territory, he entered a Europe still unsettled by the aftershocks of revolution and repression. Though the armies had fallen silent, the political questions of liberty, national rights, and constitutional government remained unresolved. Kossuth understood that without a state, his only remaining instrument was persuasion. He therefore transformed himself into a political advocate in exile, carrying the Hungarian cause across borders through speeches, meetings, and personal diplomacy. In Western Europe, his presence drew intense attention. He was no longer seen merely as a defeated revolutionary, but as a representative of a suppressed nation. Public gatherings welcomed him as a symbol of resistance against absolutism, and his speeches were carefully crafted to resonate beyond Hungarian concerns. He framed Hungary's struggle as part of a broader European conflict between constitutional liberty and imperial control. This framing allowed audiences in cities such as London and Paris to see their own political anxieties reflected in his story. Kossuth spoke calmly but firmly, emphasizing legality, moral responsibility, and the right of nations to govern themselves, ideas that traveled easily across national boundaries. His journey to the United States marked the peak of his international political influence. There, he encountered a society deeply receptive to the language of freedom and self-determination. Public receptions, large audiences, and widespread press coverage turned his visit into a major political event. Kossuth did not present himself as a ruler seeking restoration, but as a voice appealing to principles Americans believed defined their own national identity. He argued that supporting Hungary was not charity, but consistency, a test of whether liberty was a universal value or a privilege reserved for the powerful. Yet despite the enthusiasm he inspired, political reality remained unforgiving. Governments expressed sympathy, public opinion surged, but concrete intervention never followed. Kossuth came to understand the limits of moral influence in a world governed by strategic interest. Still, his activities in Europe and the United States were not in vain. He succeeded in internationalizing the Hungarian cause, ensuring it would not fade into obscurity. By turning exile into a platform rather than a silence, Kossuth reshaped defeat into enduring presence, proving that even without territory or office, a political idea could continue to travel, persuade, and endure. The final decades of Lajos Kossuth's life unfolded far from the urgency and noise of revolution, yet they were no less significant. Age and distance gradually removed him from direct political action, but not from political thought. Living mostly in exile, he watched Europe change around him, empires adapting, compromises being made, and new national movements emerging. Hungary itself moved toward partial autonomy through arrangements he neither fully controlled nor fully accepted. For Kossuth, these developments brought a quiet tension. The nation was advancing, yet not along the path he had envisioned or fought for. In his later years, Kossuth became a figure of reflection rather than intervention. He continued to write, correspond, and comment on political affairs, but his tone shifted from mobilization to judgment. He remained deeply committed to the principles of full independence and national sovereignty, often criticizing compromises he believed weakened long-term freedom for short-term stability. This stance cost him political relevance in practical terms, yet it preserved his moral consistency. He chose principle over influence, accepting isolation rather than endorsing outcomes. He felt betrayed the original aims of the struggle. As time passed, Kossuth's personal life grew quieter, marked by loss, declining health, and the steady narrowing of his world. Yet his symbolic presence only grew stronger. To many Hungarians, he represented an unbroken line of resistance, a reminder of what had once been demanded without hesitation. Even those who disagreed with his later positions recognized the scale of his sacrifice. He had given up homeland, power, and comfort for an idea that could not be fully realized in his lifetime. This endurance transformed him from a political actor into a historical conscience. When Kossuth died in 1894, his passing resonated far beyond exile. In Hungary, mourning turned into collective remembrance. He was no longer judged solely by success or failure, but by commitment, History remembered him not as a man who won power, but as one who refused to abandon responsibility when power was lost. His legacy lies in that refusal, in the insistence that national dignity, civic freedom, and moral clarity mattered even when defeat seemed final. Long after political circumstances shifted, Kossuth endured as a symbol of uncompromising principle, a voice from the past that continued to ask difficult questions of the future.